Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Forest Policy Group workshop. We're presenting the findings of a Future Woodlands Scotland sponsored project to look at the role of the state of knowledge about native woodlands and carbon sequestration at the minute. The Forest Policy Group, it's an independent group that looks to influence policy with evidence and ideas that will support a more diverse mix of forestry in Scotland. We think that communities and the environment both can benefit hugely from things like community woodlands, hardwood timber production and use of hardwood timber, non-timber forest products, restructuring conifer plantations, and native woodland expansion. And of course, you can't talk about any form of woodland expansion these days without talking about carbon. And a few years ago, as this debate was really taking off, we were watching how the amount of research and evidence getting used and the nature of the debate and how much of that debate was based on that evidence. And we saw a lot of heat and quite a lot of confusion, but we didn't see a lot of light. So we wanted to look into that and thought, well, what can we bring forward here to know about? What do we know? And that was one of the questions we asked ourselves and set out to answer. And what do we not know? And so we mainly through Willie, looking through literature, Willie McGhee, he looked at questions about what's the role of soil carbon in the way native woodland interacts with that, what's the role of different forms of ground preparation, sequestration rates between different woodland types, differences between regeneration and planting trees, issues like that. So he's going to talk about that issue and talk about where the current levels of uncertainty are about native woodland and carbon. And we also wanted to try and find out what we want to know. So what are people's perspectives, the human side of this issue? What are people's perspectives on where the future research should prioritize and where we should look to fill gaps first? And so Anna Lawrence from the group interviewed a group of stakeholders who are using carbon and carbon quantification, sequestration quantification for offsets, and marketing those, and just asking them what are their perspectives on this issue and on where we need to know about first. So with that in mind, by the way, please do put any questions you have into the chat. We'll have about half an hour from Willie and Anna. So put any questions you have into the chat, and we'll have about half an hour to kind of discuss the issues that are of most interest to you. So we will shortly put the record. In fact, we're already recording. So if you've got if you're shy at all, you turn off your camera. And with that, Willie, can you please take over?
Everyone, you have to bear with me while I do the share screen and get my presentation up. A few things before I start. I've been given 15 minutes to romp through a subject which I think if I'd had an hour, I would still feel slightly pushed. So can I apologize for a couple of things? One is possible use of terminology which may be unfamiliar to you. Tons of carbon, tons of CO2 equivalent, carbon stock, carbon sequestration, carbon uptake. All these terms will be sort of thrown in. Obviously, people can ask questions afterwards, but without further ado, I will try and do the share screen. Okay, so Alan has introduced me. I'm part of the Forest Policy Group, and we were given this piece of work to do on behalf of Future Woodlands. There's a lot of heat and light about carbon. I've been working in carbon since the early 1990s, when myself and others set up something called the Edinburgh Centre for Carbon Management. And there was a large period of my life where I thought I'd seen the last of carbon. But in the last 5 or 6 years, it has, with natural capital, become a thing again. So carbon, biomass, native woodlands. Alan stole a little bit of my thunder. Native woodlands are often complex. This is because of their architecture, structure, species composition, stocking density, blah, blah. one of the picture here is not complex. This is a high oak woodland, and in terms of its biomass, certainly for the above ground biomass, it's relatively straightforward to measure it. However, this is not the case with most of our native woodlands, and especially the native woodlands, the new native woodlands that we're creating. Native woodlands are less well researched. Much of our research has been on commercial conifer for very obvious reasons, money. Measuring biomass, that's below ground biomass, that includes the roots and the soil and the biomass in the canopy, the crown, the branches. All of these things are expensive. All of these things take time. Other countries, the USA, France, Australia, New Zealand, they have done a lot of work on it. The UK, not so much. And how do we get that? You know, do we take a West Coast Atlantic oak hazel rainforest, chop it down, weigh it, dig up the roots? Probably not. What has happened in the past 30 years, 30, 40 years, is that we've had things called flux towers. These are instruments that sit over the canopy of woodland. None in Scotland over a native woodland, one over a Sitka spruce forest near Aberfeldy, but much of the work has been done over high forests in the south of England. And so we don't have much data. And if you turn to your woodland carbon code, you're intent on planting a native woodland, you want to know how much carbon is in it, you'll find that you have things called biomass expansion factors, coefficients that allow you to calculate the root biomass and the canopy biomass. The last time I looked, all of the native woodland types were being benchmarked against oak and beech for the canopies, and all broadleaves in the UK are benchmarked, or were benchmarked, against red alder for some reason which I've not really been able to figure out. How do we change this? Well, we've got new technology, terrestrial laser scanning, I'll say a little bit about later, and of course those flux towers, of which we don't have anything in Scotland, but we could and should. Native woodlands in the uplands, on upland soils, the reason I put this in is because soils are by far and away our biggest terrestrial carbon store. Woodlands are planted on top of them, and obviously they influence how the trees grow, and the trees have an influence on the soils. This is a picture of Carafran wildwood in the Scottish borders. I was involved in selling the carbon from this in 2000. And as you can see, native woodlands are patchy, not uniform, as Alan said, and very difficult to predict in terms of their uptake. And another thing that we're beginning to learn about native woodlands is that birch, Scots pine, they influence what goes on underneath in the soil. So there's work that's been done on heather moorland in the northeast of Scotland, where the supposition is that birch is depleting soil carbon as opposed to adjacent heather moorland. So, you know, there's 2 or 3 papers. One, Alan MacDonald there was involved with, Emily Warner, Trees for Life, found that there was a suggestion that mycorrhiza chemical composition is having an effect. So there's a lot of things we're just beginning to learn. That doesn't stand for Scots pine woodland. Very briefly, Scots pine inputs carbon into the soil through needle deposition. That goes into the litter and humus layer. So when you look at old growth, say in the likes of Rothiemurchus or Glenmore, then you find that the carbon balance is often higher in the old growth Scots pine wood than the adjacent heather moorland. That's because it's all going into the top of the soil. That's more labile and raises a few questions of its own. Numbers, how do we get the numbers? As I say, I apologize not only for the speed of presentation, but also the skiting over the top of a lot of technical stuff. Basically, as foresters in this audience will know, we reach for our yield class. We calculate yield class, which is a measure of productivity on the basis of site. We can stick our grid reference into the ecological site classification. Forest Research is an excellent tool, and it will spit out the suitability of either the tree species or the NVC type. In this chart here, 3 figures to note. The biggest one, obviously, mixed native broadleaf woodland, yield class 6 on mineral soil. Planting on mineral soil, you're assuming that the carbon in the soil is going to grow. When you look at the most modest in here, that's the downy birch woodland on organic soil, yield class 2. What's not factored in here, and one of the things that I think the Woodland Carbon Code may be wise to look at, is what impacts that things like downy birch and other native trees are having on that organic soil. One other thing before, or 2 other things before I leave this. One, the top 2 figures, mixed native woodlands 84.1. I was involved with Mike Perks and Forest Research when we were advising BP on the Scottish Forest Alliance. And we came up with a carbon stock figure. That's a storage. That's what's there after 100 years. You're using a model. You're using old empirical data and a model and biomass coefficients. The figure underneath it, natural regen, was developed by Nature Scott, and that is an interesting attempt to try and look at what natural regen will attain in terms of carbon and a sequestration rate. I think it is very optimistic, and I'll get onto that in the next slide. So I would be doing a disservice to the Forest Policy Group if I didn't talk a little bit about commercial forestry, because in the world that we live, we have a continual benchmarking of agriculture, forestry, and then internally we have native woodlands versus commercial woodlands. So we know that the monoculture, regular planted conifer species, much simpler branching structure, a lot more data, a huge amount more biomass research for very obvious reasons, and that's down to money. And then when we benchmark it against native woodlands, say on organo-mineral soils, then very obviously conifers do much better, and in many cases on mineral soils as well. But there's a however, and the however in this is that something like 20% of Scotland's 20% of our commercial conifer is on organic soil. And we plant, we cultivate, we drain, clear fell, restock carbon emissions. The time frame for timber products, nobody can quite agree on. Scottish Forestry have already discussed internally shortening clear fell rotations, bigger clear fell sites. These all have an impact on carbon storage. And the Scottish Government in 2025 predicts that Scottish Forestry as a whole will be a net emitter, and this is in part due to what I've just talked about. So one of the things that I would suggest is that while conifers are great and they have their place, they may not be stable carbon stores as many envisage. Establishing new native woodlands, greenhouse gas cost, this is factored into the Woodland Carbon Code, that we cultivate, we might scarify, we use tubes, we use herbicide, we fence, we deer stalk, and you know that is a factor in what we're predicting native woodlands will uptake. Natural regeneration, on the other hand, maybe, I say maybe because we still have to deer fence, we still have to stalk. But the thing with natural regeneration is that it is tricky, it's stochastic, it's unpredictable. We don't really know quite what we're going to get at the end of the day. I mean, we've seen the patchiness in that photograph with the wildwood planting, what native woodlands when they're planted looks like. Well, regeneration, we really often have no idea. One thing natural regeneration would be really useful for and is good for is regenerating old senescing woodlands like ghost woodlands. So natural regen will act as a carbon sequestering agent. So more numbers, apologies for more numbers, but this is just, I'm going to talk a little bit about old woodlands because I think that we don't know enough about our existing woodlands. We certainly in Scotland know very little. And from this set of figures, you can see the top two numbers. They're Woodland Trust derived from Forest Research National Inventory. They are much lower than these figures, which are measured figures, measured as in stem wood, and then using models to extrapolate biomass in the crown and roots. But these are from English woodlands. And again, I would just draw your attention to the ancient woodland 120. That was in a place called Witham Woods. And that was teams of guys with tapes measuring diameters and then doing the carbon modeling. The bottom figure, 194, is using technology. That's using terrestrial laser scanning, which is quite expensive, but is becoming less expensive. And what this technology told us was the ancient woodlands store high quantities of carbon, but a lot of it is in old trees. So when they used laser scanning in Witham, they found that there was approximately 1.7 times the carbon that they previously calculated using the standard techniques that we're using in WCC and others. And that 50% of the biomass was in big old trees. Now, obviously, that big old tree there is not in Witham Woods. That's in the Black Wood of Rannoch. But the trees that these were in were more than 53 centimetres diameter at breast height. So these big old trees in ancient woodlands are performing a very valuable carbon storage function. And there's a suggestion, actually more than a suggestion in the northwest of the US, but there's a suggestion and a debate around the strength of these old woodlands. What are they doing? Are they sitting there emitting with dead wood? Well, yes, that is the case. Dead wood, when it decomposes, emits greenhouse gases. So a lot of dead wood in an old woodland will reduce its efficiency as a sink. But in the northern US, they found that often these old woodlands act as carbon pumps. They're taking CO2 from the atmosphere and they're sticking it into the soil. But again, a lot of debate. There is a Woodland Trust statement, which is something along the lines that in the next century we're going to have twice as much carbon in our ancient woodlands as we've got as of 2022, which is an interesting statistic. So to conclude, we don't know enough, I don't think, about native woodlands and ancient woodlands. I say this when, as I mentioned about wildwood, when we started in the wacky world of carbon and carbon selling, the carbon price was relatively modest, and nobody really cared whether you were underestimating or overestimating the carbon. And even now, I guess a lot of people are quite relaxed about the science. But with prices of carbon going up, then I would suggest that we should spend more money and more effort using new technology and flux stores to measure what we have in Scotland. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Willie. That was really interesting, and yeah, a noble run through what was quite a dense report. So there is plenty more depth to that on the website. I'll post the link to that just shortly, so you can read Willie and Anna's report coming through. I think it was a good point to close on there. Basically, there's a lot more to find out about and to really understand about native woodlands and carbon. But of course, the other side of this, in terms of how we behave and apply that knowledge, depends on humans and their variations. So with that in mind, we asked Anna to speak to a few stakeholders and start to get some understanding of how people are using the science that we have and the evidence that we have to apply that to the carbon market where this is coming out. So Anna, over to you. You might just want to switch that into slideshow mode.
Yeah, just doing that. Can you hear me?
We can, you're good.
Okay, slideshow, come along. There we are. Hello, everybody, and thanks for coming. Thanks, Willie, for compressing all of that into such a focused presentation. And as Alan said, I'm going to talk about the human side of it. It's a very short report. There's a sort of complement add-on to what Willie did, which is kind of, given that we've got the science in the state that it's in, and given that that is translated to advisors and landowners, what difference does it make, and what do those advisors and landowners want to see in terms of information and science? So I'm just going to very quickly, in hopefully about 6 minutes, tell you about the results of asking stakeholders what they thought about all of this. It focused on the land managers, particularly the community sector, but also commercial agents and a range of woodland NGOs. And it was what we call semi-structured interview, but based around the big question of how do you navigate the knowledge and information about carbon in native woodlands. So from that, what would you like to see in terms of better information? How does the information affect what you do? So compared with Willie's report, it's focusing particularly on new woodland, because that's where the Woodland Carbon Code has its influence, and it's summarising people's perceptions, not science. So it's how are people understanding this information, and because when people behave, when they take action, it's based on perception, not based on fact. So it's quite important distinction to understand there. So the first question was, what difference does it make, the fact that there is carbon finance, there is the Woodland Carbon Code? What difference is that making in terms of woodland, native woodland creation? And of course, that the additionality criteria came in just as we were doing this research, so that made it an even closer, tighter filter in terms of focusing more on native woodland. But there were different approaches. There were some users were using it as an approach to make native woodland planting feasible on the grounds that the woodland grant scheme doesn't cover all of the costs of establishment. Others were using it to enable them to do better management, to for example, do bracken management that didn't use chemicals, so more expensive approaches. And others were using it as a language to help to bring together stakeholders such as landowners and NGOs to see common goals. So they did focus on some of the constraints that Willie mentioned, less on the science, more on the fact that it doesn't support natural regeneration, but that's not a lack of information so much as the basic uncertainty underlying natural regeneration, and the fact that finance ties up the land as a long-term commitment. So these in themselves are not information constraints. So if we look at what people were concerned about in terms of knowledge and information, overall, there was a recognition that the science, people always use the word clunky in relation to Woodland Carbon Code, but that wasn't actually something that troubled people a great deal. It troubled the agents more than the landowners, but on the whole, people saw the Woodland Carbon Code as underestimating carbon rather than overestimating it. That's not necessarily correct, but that's what people were thinking. They were much more concerned about markets than the science. People used the language of Wild West, Gold Rush, Klondike, etc. People talked about having to work with the kinds of people that they'd never worked with before. They didn't know if they could trust them. They felt pressure of a hard sell. And for some people, carbon was just a fairy tale and just something completely unreal, and they couldn't really see how you could be selling it. And then, of course, the story affects the value of the carbon. So it's not just about tons of carbon. It's about, does it come with a nice picture? Does it come with a community story behind it, etc. So you can't kind of just take the numbers out and treat them as something independent of the context. But if we push a bit harder and go upstream, where's that information coming from? How's that influencing what people are doing? The agents and advisors were frustrated. They did recognise the patchiness of the science, the unevenness, and they focused particularly on gaps around what's going on below ground and the whole life cycle of the carbon and what happens after felling, etc. Quite interestingly, so some of the agents expressed kind of astonishment and frustration about the lack of, just need to go back one, about the lack of attention to these gaps in science, given that carbon is such a big issue in what's happening for us at this moment in evolution. but they also saw the 15-year verification point as an opportunity for new data. That's a point at which people are coming in and saying, we need to know actually how much carbon is there, not how much has been modelled using the Woodland Carbon Code. And we're seeing some privately funded new data coming along. So I think that's quite interesting. There's the Bunloit report, which is referenced in my wee report, Highland Rewilding commissioning their own assessment, and NGOs who didn't want their research to be publicised at this stage, but also commissioning their own data. And something that was interesting that came out of that, which seems to support people's perception that Woodland Carbon Code underestimates the carbon, was that when you look more, when you measure in more detail and with better methods, we're actually finding more carbon from the establishment of new native woodland. So I think when the kind of what this boils down to was that people felt not so much that they're dealing with new information. They know that there's new science, new information out there, but what they're focusing on is the need to deal with new actors, new people that they're not used to dealing with. So agents coming into the story, a wide range of buyers, some of the buyers more ethical than others in the views of the sellers. And people wanting trusted intermediaries. They wanted agents in between who could help them to find the right buyer and who could explain the market to them. And it was interesting because the kind of three approaches of three NGOs moving into that space. The UK and Scotland's always got quite a kind of patchy approach to woodland advisory systems compared to a lot of other countries, and so NGOs kind of move in and develop new strategies to deal with these gaps. And one of them was just being pragmatic, was using it to get more of their own woodland into the ground. One was becoming quite competitive with other agents and seeking to influence a lot of landowners. And one was really building up a very diplomatic approach, bringing together very traditional estate owners and trying to find a common ground to change behaviour. So it was interesting just to see that diversification of strategy in there. So just a few take-home messages. It's the agents and the advisors who are basically seeing problems with the science. They don't see it as the biggest problem. They see trust. Everybody said trust and finding your way through markets and the plurality of agents as what concerns them more, and having to find new ways to talk to different people. The importance of the story around the carbon, and behind that, this last point, there's room for innovation. I think this is what I would want to emphasize, that there's room for a new style of advisor and intermediaries who are bringing together different parts of the productive and consuming side of carbon. There was a strong emphasis by most people on the emergence of other credit schemes, not just carbon, but wetland and biodiversity, and seeing that as quite important in the future and keeping your options open there. Looking at closer relationships also with the investors, and a kind of emergence of a new kind of investor who was quite tech savvy, and therefore feeding into the possibility of getting better data to fill some of the gaps that Willie highlighted by finding innovative ways of measuring the carbon, particularly at that verification stage, 15 years. So thank you for listening, and back to Alan.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you for those who are putting questions in the chat. By all means, keep those coming, because there's all sorts of questions this kind of work raises and all sorts of things ahead. So and really now is just a kind of space to consider those questions and have a bit of a conversation amongst ourselves. So if you want to stick your cameras on and have that chat. But well, if we can come to you first, Victor's put a question in the chat about Downy Birch, yield class 2, and how the biomass gets accounted for in the calculations that we can use so far, and there's some of that modelling and estimates that are coded in your report. Would you care to comment, Mr. McGhee?
Yeah, sorry, Victor. That was a question about the biomass, the yield class 2 biomass. That's been run through the Woodland Carbon Code calculator, which is an Excel spreadsheet, and it has these biomass coefficients in it, which account for root and shoot, root and crown. Is that what you're asking about? Am I understanding this correctly?
Yeah, I'm just wondering why the yield class can be 2, but the average sequestration of carbon can be more than that.
And that's because it's, I mean, I think Jeanette had something in about the ways that trees grow. So you've got an asymptotic curve, so that what you're looking at is an averaged over the 100 years. It doesn't grow in a linear manner. It grows in a reverse hockey stick manner. So it's not that the birch is growing at that rate every year. That's the averaged over the whole 100 years.
Yeah, I understand that, but that curve is the same for carbon and biomass in general?
Roughly speaking.
I realize I'm probably asking a question there's no answer to.
Not sure I'm understanding, Victor. The biomass and carbon are directly linked. They the biomass growing and the carbon growing look pretty much the same if you map them. Not in terms of the value, but in terms of the shape of the curve.
Well, it might be worth just discussing or just mentioning where that data comes from on yield class that goes into the carbon code calculation, so the vintage of that research and what it's based on.
The yield class, well, I get my yield class either from looking at a site and doing the kind of, or going into something like the ESC ecological site classification, and that's got degree days, temperature, soil moisture deficit, elevation aspect. I mean, there's a whole series of factors that go in there, and we can. In fact, if you go into the report, you'll see the links to ESC, and you can go in and you can have a look at all the different characteristics. The interesting, Victor, the values that were in that WCC calculation, I took from about half a dozen sites in Highland Perthshire. One a kind of lowland-ish site on good quality ground. That would be the higher yield class 6, and then the birch yield class 2 would be on organo-mineral, heather moorland on the side of a hill somewhere.
Okay, thank you, Willie.
Yeah, thanks, Willie. There are a couple of questions here about, well, first one about the research you quoted, Willie, about the scenario in which productive forestry could become a net emitter of carbon.
That was the Arena Woodland Trust forwarded the Scottish Government Statistics Branch projections for our greenhouse gas budgets, and in 2025, I've got the chart somewhere, whoever it is, I can forward it to them, or they can speak to somebody in Scottish Forestry, at the top of Scottish Forestry, because they'll know what I'm talking about. Essentially, we've got 2 or 3 factors working. We've got very, very large clear fell sites. We've got an increase in felling. And it's just it's a thing. It's not a good or a bad. It's just a thing. That's what the projections are within the Scottish Government, that overall in the land use sector, emissions, forestry will be negative in that year. Then it goes positive again.
It's part of the cycle.
Yeah.
So can I just say that I think that's probably an important message what you said at the end there, really, is that then it goes positive. So I think that's the part of the story that actually we need to recognise, is that, yeah, with felling and whatever, then yeah, we're going to lose carbon, but eventually it does go positive. And you're looking to 2025, and we all know that the forestry timescales and carbon timescales need to be long term, and we need to look at that longer term picture. So I think the Scottish Government report is because of that reporting timescale and what it needs to report for 2025, and that's why it looks like that. So I just wanted to flag that, you know, it's quite a strong message, and we need to sometimes be aware of the bigger picture and the longer term picture.
I think I would contend we don't have the bigger picture. And the reason we don't have the bigger picture is we don't currently have the draining and mounding for restock included in calculations on organic soils. We don't have the impact of clear felling on organic soil. So yeah, I agree, we should take it as a round, but as part of the known unknowns, I don't think we know very well what the carbon cycle is across the board, native and commercial.
I do agree. I think having spoken to forest research as well, there's a lot that we don't know, and it's what do we do in the interim, and how do we better, you know, target and understand what areas are most suitable to specific species or for peatland restoration or all that different stuff, and we don't have an understanding, and I think that's the challenge, is what do we do in the interim until we do have a better understanding.
Mm-hmm. And presumably where should the priorities be for research to fill those gaps, to fill that in? And that maybe touches on Jeanette's question here about how confident we are about the trajectory for carbon sequestration. Where exactly does this hockey stick graph lie, and is that something we need to know more about? How confident are you in the hockey stick, Willie?
Not hugely. But anyone that's in this audience that has spent years trying to grow native woodlands will be able to tell you that it's a very mixed bag in terms of how trees grow and the rates at which they grow and the years at which you get, you know, bits of check, drought, effects of drought, or, you know, so it's just, we're dealing with a biological system, and I'm not saying we should know everything about it, but the fact that we know so very, very little about the native woodland component and how they're growing is amazing. We've got a marketplace and we've got all this kind of heat and light, and yet we don't really know very much about the subjects that we're growing. Juniper, you know, alder, all these things, they've all got the same coefficients from, you know, derived from trees in another part of the country. Red alder, I mean, where did we get that from? You know, I used to work overseas in carbon projects, and labour was cheap. You could dig up trees and you could weigh them and measure them. We've never dug up an ancient woodland or dug up a native woodland or measured it in a way that they have in other countries. Sorry, that was tending towards a rant there.
Rant's welcome. Good point. There's a question from Jacob here, Willie, about natural regeneration and whether we should be, is there a suggestion that we should be wary of using that as a management strategy for woodland carbon code projects? What's your view on?
Sorry, Alan, I think the way forward is to use natural regeneration wherever possible. And I say that for commercial forestry as well. I think that we need to get out of the ditches of straightforward tree planting and try to learn from our continental colleagues about how to manage natural regeneration. And the same goes for native woodland. One of the pictures I had was of natural regeneration on a Perthshire hillside. We're not making any effort to manage it because there is no carbon, and that's not the objective of the woodland. But by all means, let us have natural regeneration and carbon, but let's do more of it and understand it better. I've seen very few research publications where, you know, natural regeneration sites of Scotland. You know, we've got hundreds of thousands of publications of the timber properties of Sitka spruce and where it will grow. We've got hee-haw about most of our native species and how they grow in any respect. You know, there's not enough money being chucked at it. Sorry, there's another mini rant.
Can I just chip in there and add from the user's side, so the social research side, that I went in with the expectation that people would say that the incentives and the woodland carbon code and science were a disincentive to natural regeneration, and without and while still agreeing fully with everything that Willie said, people said it was the uncertainty, and so it was the needing to have better management systems rather than needing to have better data in the woodland carbon code, specifically about regeneration. So that reinforces Willie's point that we need to understand the ecology of it better and to be more confident about having outcomes when you're using natural regeneration as a strategy. And there are lots of examples of people using natural regeneration and some examples of getting carbon credits for it, but it was just a much more uncertain route, and therefore people not doing it. But it didn't come back to the science so much as the actual management practice techniques.
The thing is that nowadays, sorry, Alan, I'm just going to chip in, but we didn't have these things like terrestrial laser scanning and a lot of this, the drone technology. We can combine a lot of these types of technology and AI to get a much better handle on things like regeneration. But it needs people doing it. It needs people like Forest Research leading and or others, or as Anna said, private sector people doing this thing and showing the way.
Okay, we are running out of questions, but there is one here about, I guess it's about the role of forestry and woodlands within the LULUCF sector, and the extent to which, do we have any feel for how that compares with other sources of land use emission? Is it the sector as a whole that's an emitter, given farmland as well as forestry? How does this match up?
The comment I made about the 2025, that was only forestry. I mean, forestry is it's a positive for the Scottish government to set against the enormous emissions from agriculture. I don't have a handle on the percentage of Scotland's emissions, but land use will come in from fertilizer, animals. There'll be an enormous emissions budget deficit, and so what the government has done is that they've pushed forestry as something that can offset, if you like, the land use emissions that we've got. I'm sorry, I don't actually have the figures for what proportion, but I think it's relatively modest in comparison to agricultural emissions. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. There are a lot of points in the chat, a lot of support for natural regeneration as part of the solution, and a lot of calls for more knowledge. Thank you, Neil. So that's interesting. There's research coming out next year with some results coming through about natural regeneration and how that can work. I think that there's a clear, I think what we're seeing here is a clear appetite, a clear need for more information and evidence as to how that works. And maybe some of the other comments coming through kind of suggest, do we need to kind of start this whole discussion from scratch again? If we want to sequester carbon through land use and forestry, and that was part of net zero, how do we do that? So actually the emphasis goes on emissions reduction, which is the key source here, and how do we build more evidence and certainty into carbon offsetting and how that can work. And so I'm just going to open the floor to anybody who wants to opine on that, and actually how we might kind of bring that about, given that we are running on rails up to a point. There is a carbon market that is driving land value and affecting a whole range of other issues around the Highlands and the Scottish countryside. Does anyone have any views on how we might start a conversation or start a process that gets us to something more founded and clear and consensual?
Still in silence. Oh, Andy.
Andy's got his hand up.
Yeah, thanks. That's really, really interesting. I look forward to reading the reports. I mean, my view is that with all this uncertainty around, and with the timescales that we're talking about in relationship to the potential for woodland to sequester carbon, and the timescales involved in achieving net zero, and the timescales involved in avoiding 1.5, which we probably now have missed, the policy focus should certainly be about more woodland, peatland restoration, wetland restoration. These are all good things for more than just climate policy points of view. They're, in fact, possibly even more important for biodiversity, for flood control, and various other things. And the economic and financial incentives being provided by carbon markets, I think, are distorting that policy. I mean, I have a view on carbon markets and all the rest of it, but setting that aside, they're distorting that policy because they're placing greater focus on answering the questions that you've been addressing this morning. I don't think the questions that are being posed this morning are all that important in the bigger picture of climate policy. Yes, let's have more woodlands. Yes, let's restore peatlands. Let's do as much as we possibly can, right? But at the end of the day, all of that is going to have very limited impact on net zero, given the timescales and given the ongoing growth in emissions from transport, from energy, as Willie says, ongoing from agriculture. You know, this is a drop in the ocean. So I think that's my key takeaway from this, is we have distorted these discussions by the presumption that this is all hugely significant element of getting to net zero. I just don't think it is in comparison to other policies.
Yeah, the market as an enabler of the status quo. So are we offsetting or are we reducing? And if we're not reducing, we're wasting our time. It's not going to happen in time. And I think that the point around timescale seems very important, because we talk about, you know, carbon units are pretty much about future sequestration and how relevant that is to 1.5 by 2045 or 2050. That's decidedly moot. Andy, do you want to come back on that?
So just the other thing, which I mean, I'm an amateur at all of this, but it seems to me that we know that with a fair degree of certainty that commercial conifer plantations sequester a lot of carbon. The extent to which the relationship, the relative amounts with native woodlands and stuff, we're less certain about because we know less about native woodlands, but there's no doubt that they sequester a lot of carbon. So it seems to me that if you want trees to play a role in climate policy, you should be seeking to sequester as much carbon by known methods as possible, and in this, consider the full life cycle. So there is a prima facie an argument for more fast-growing conifers harvested and turned into long-lasting timber products that will then add another 100 years of carbon storage, and hopefully another 100 years after that. I mean, timber lasts, if it's well looked after, lasts literally, well, we don't know forever, but it lasts centuries. There are timber buildings that are 600 and 700 years old. So, I mean, if we want a very clinical approach to this, that is one route we know we can go down, but it involves dealing with supply chains and processing and timber manufacture and forest products manufacture and building technology and building standards, as much as it does with nature and land and woods.
Can I come back on that? Yeah, I would go along with it, Andy, if we had a timber industry modelled on something like the continental timber sector, who were growing quality conifers that were being harvested and put in, well, harvested on an appropriate scale, and then put into something that had longevity, but we don't. We've if you look at the breakdown from the timber sector of where our timber goes, a lot of it is going into biomass. A lot of it is going into small roundwood. A lot of it is going into pallets. A lot of it is going into fencing. A lot of it's going into sheds. You'd be surprised at how much timber softwood goes into sheds. So we're not doing the thing that you would like us to do in terms of the larch and the Douglas fir and the quality timber, which would go into long-lasting buildings and things. And if I kind of circle back, I would agree with your original premise that the carbon, certainly for me, is interesting not because of its status as carbon, but because of the biomass and the ecology of the forest. And I think that and Jeanette has said this as well, that if we look at it in the round of the biodiversity value in terms of native woodlands, and the other services, the other bits of, if you like, natural capital that are ecosystem services that they provide, then we should look at it more in the round rather than just the carbon. I think the other thing is that nobody really, you didn't pick up on Alan's point about the role that natural capital is playing in land values in rural areas in Scotland, where we have a sort of a skewing, if you like, of the land market, and that's something we'd be interested if anyone's got any opinions about as well.
Yeah, certainly. Well, a land agent told me that there's a piece of, this was 2 years ago. He looked at a piece of an estate that was on the market. He valued it, and it went for, I think he said 4 times that amount for the perceived woodland carbon code potential within it. Jamie.
Thanks, Alan. I just I know it's broader than the specific theme of this webinar, but I think the elephant in the room is offsetting, and that's the reason why we're kind of counting carbon, so people can sell it. And why are we selling carbon? It's to so-called offset, and plenty of people have called this out. I know Andy's got some views on that, which he politely didn't stray into. But very respected climate scientists like Kevin Anderson, who's done some really good dismantling of the arguments of offsetting. And he's a huge fan of trees, but he says plant trees for good tree reasons. And that would be like you're building centuries old buildings and so on. It's not to kind of offset people's consumer lifestyles. And I think part of the problem with the Woodland Carbon Code, probably the biggest problem, is it has no control over what the carbon sold is used for. And there isn't even much discussion of things like carbon mitigation hierarchy. So offsetting is taken to be the first resort rather than the last resort, as it should be in a mitigation hierarchy. And the classic example of this is in the Carbon Code's own case studies, where they give Waitrose supermarkets, and many of you will have heard me rant about this one before, but Waitrose is praised for using carbon credits to basically offset the tailpipe emissions of its home delivery vehicles. Now, in what planet is that an essential or an unavoidable or hard to eliminate emission? We have a system that in theory is great, and had it sufficient control over what is being offset, it might be a valuable tool. But instead, what companies are basically doing are making a commercial decision that it's cheaper to buy carbon credits than actually reduce emissions. So far from solving the problem, it's actually getting it worse. And until we focus on that, a lot of the rest of this is a wee bit academic. So apologies for that wee rant.
Thanks for that, Jamie. I think that's very pertinent. I guess part of a riposte, not a riposte, but part of an answer to that would be, well, how do we, in pragmatic terms, how do you move what is a capitalist society, other than through some of the economic language that comes with offsetting and how that works? And some of that might come, is just carbon too cheap? I'm absolutely convinced that it's far too cheap at the minute. But yeah, that's there's a whole can of worms under that slight disagreement there.
Can I just say that I'm appalled at Jamie McIntyre taking issue with Waitrose? I mean, we're in the south of Edinburgh. Do you not have a Waitrose in Lochaber?
I just wanted to chip in and say that all of the people that I interviewed agreed with this this view that's being expressed, that the concern about using the carbon arguments as a mainstay for supporting tree planting, and they all said, it's a useful tool for us. That's why I emphasised on my first slide. It's a tool that they use to help them achieve their purposes, which are tree planting. So it's another tool in the box, but they didn't go along with the seeing native woodland as just about carbon, and wanted it to be valued for a lot of other reasons. So I hope that's just stating the obvious, but I wanted to kind of say that is the wider view as well.
Yeah, I should perhaps declare an interest as an NGO, with my day hat on, an NGO seller of carbon offsets, and the sometimes discomfort that comes with that, and how we try to frame that with integrity around who's buying that and what their attitudes their attitudes are to emissions reduction, and how that has become increasingly uncomfortable to the point that we've stopped for now and having a real think about how you can adequately vet people's intentions to that and whether we can act in that way. So I think the challenges that we're facing, to me, feel like there's a lot of, we need to be in grey areas, and the more evidence we have around that and the more objective data we have around that, the easier that will be to shine a light on that. If there are no further questions, then I will wrap up. Thank you all for coming. I will point you again. Well, I guess what would be interested in, and FPG would be interested in, is where this discussion goes next, because there are some really big and pertinent issues there, both for climate change and for Scottish land use and everything that is affected by that. So the group will be interested in your thoughts on that. Sharon has posted a link to contacting us if you're interested in continuing that conversation. It's in the chat. And on the same website which I posted earlier, there are direct links to Willie and Anna's reports there. So if you can kind of find real chapter and verse on that and the work they've done, those are well worth a look. And I just want to close with another voice of thanks for Future Woodlands Scotland, who funded this work and allowed to go on. So it's been good to work with them. That's been much appreciated. And with that, I wish you all a very nice day.